What if I told you that 65 Australian soldiers walked into a village expecting to fight 40 Viet Cong, and instead found themselves surrounded by 400 North Vietnamese regulars armed with the newest Soviet weapons? I'm talking about an intelligence failure so catastrophic, so inexcusable, that it should have resulted in total annihilation. But that's not the horror. The real horror isn't about the numbers. It's about what happened when those 65 men realized they were trapped in a grid of brick houses where every door could hide death, where 30-ton tanks became steel coffins, and where 21-year-olds fresh off the plane died in their first minute of combat. Why did Australian intelligence fail so completely? How did junior soldiers, privates commanding rifle sections, survive 8 hours of room-to-room hell? And why has this specific battle been treated as a footnote when it was the fiercest urban combat Australians fought in Vietnam? Stick with me, because what happened at Binh Ba on June 6, 1969, will rewrite everything you think you know about modern urban warfare. The morning air over Phuoc Tuy province hung thick and still, the kind of oppressive heat that made sweat bead on foreheads before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. It was 8 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1969, and the crew of an Australian Centurion tank had every reason to believe this would be another routine run up Route 2 toward the village of Binh Ba. The tank commander sat exposed in his cupola, scanning the landscape with practiced eyes, while his driver navigated the packed earth road that wound through rubber plantations and rice paddies. Behind them, an armored recovery vehicle followed at a cautious distance, ready to provide assistance if the Centurion threw a track or suffered mechanical failure. They were heading north to support elements of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, who were engaged in heavy fighting 8 kilometers beyond the village. The route was classified amber, contact possible but unlikely. The village itself, less than 10 kilometers from the Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat, was considered secure under the protection of South Vietnamese regional forces. Binh Ba was a tidy, rectangular settlement of approximately 1,000 to 3,000 people, mainly farmers and workers from the nearby Plantation Gallia rubber estate. The houses were solidly constructed of brick and tile, a relative prosperity that spoke to the village's economic importance. A white-gabled school stood near the center, and the grid of 4 main roads created a sense of order that seemed almost European in its regularity. The Australians had known this village well since establishing their base in 1966. During the 5th Battalion's first tour, a rifle company and mortar section had been briefly stationed within Binh Ba itself, a strategy that deterred Viet Cong tax collectors and assassination squads from operating openly. The presence of Australian soldiers had provided a shield of security that allowed villagers to go about their lives without fear of midnight visits from communist cadres demanding rice, money, or sons to join the revolution. But the drain on the small Australian force had proven too great, and by 1969, the village had been left to regional force protection. The withdrawal had been gradual, reluctant, a recognition that the Australian task force simply didn't have enough manpower to maintain permanent positions in every village while simultaneously conducting offensive operations against main force enemy units in the jungle. The rocket-propelled grenade that screamed out of the rubber trees and struck the Centurion's turret was not a warning shot. It was an invitation. The impact rang like a hammer blow against an anvil, the shaped charge warhead penetrating the steel and detonating inside the turret with devastating effect. The loader operator collapsed with severe wounds, and the turret mechanism jammed, freezing the massive 20-pounder gun in place. The tank commander opened fire with his .30 caliber machine gun, sweeping the tree line where the smoke trail originated, while the armored recovery vehicle added the fire of two similar weapons. The stricken Centurion continued north toward a friendly village post, trailing hydraulic fluid and smoke, while the recovery vehicle withdrew south to Nui Dat to report the attack. That single RPG round, fired from a house that looked exactly like every other house in the village, was not a wayward shot from an undisciplined guerrilla. It was the opening move in a battle that would rage for 48 hours and leave much of Binh Ba in ruins. But the Australians sleeping in their bunks at Nui Dat that morning had no idea that while they had been writing letters home and cleaning their rifles, an entire enemy battalion had moved into position less than 10 kilometers away. On the evening of June 5th, as the tropical sun set over Phuoc Toi province, a combined communist force began infiltrating Binh Ba under cover of darkness. The operation was conducted with the precision of a well-rehearsed drill. 1st Battalion of the 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment moved through the village in small groups, guided by members of the Binh Ba guerrilla squad who knew every alley, every house, every hiding place accumulated over lifetimes lived in these streets. Elements of the D-440 Provincial Mobile Battalion followed, along with fighters from the Ngai Jiao Guerrilla Squad and the Chao Duc District Company. By dawn on June 6th, somewhere between 200 and 400 enemy soldiers had occupied defensive positions throughout the village. This was not a random infiltration or an opportunistic raid. The occupation of Binh Ba was part of a coordinated offensive involving 122 enemy-initiated attacks across the 3rd Corps area of operations. The timing was no accident. On May 19th, the American media had publicly announced that President Richard Nixon would meet South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu at Midway Island on June 8th. The communist leadership viewed this as an opportunity to demonstrate their continuing capability to conduct offensive action throughout South Vietnam, to show the world that despite peace negotiations in Paris and despite impending American troop withdrawals, they could strike at will. The announcement of troop reductions, 25,000 American soldiers scheduled to leave Vietnam, had been portrayed as a sign of Allied weakness. The Communists intended to reinforce that perception with a wave of attacks that would dominate international headlines and demonstrate that they retained the strategic initiative despite years of sustained Allied military operations. The formation of their own provisional revolutionary government was scheduled for June 10th, and they wanted the preceding days filled with headlines about communist military victories. Binh Ba, sitting practically in the shadow of the Australian headquarters, was selected as a high-value target whose capture would provide maximum propaganda impact. The intelligence picture available to the Australians that morning was simultaneously clear and disastrously incomplete. Signals intelligence had tracked the 33rd NVA Regiment operating in the area north of Nui Dat. The regiment's assessed strength stood at 1,075 troops organized into 3 battalions, and Australian commanders knew they were out there somewhere in the jungle. Radio direction finding had pinpointed their general location. Pattern analysis of previous attacks had suggested their operational methods. Just 4 days earlier, on June 2nd, the D-440 Battalion had been surprised by elements of 6th Battalion during Operation Laverack, forcing the enemy to adjust their attack plans for Binh Ba. But somehow, despite all this intelligence collection and despite the fact that a major enemy force had been tracked moving through the province, no one at 1st Australian Task Force headquarters had connected the dots. No one had warned the Ready Reaction Force that they might be walking into something far worse than a couple of Viet Cong platoons causing trouble in a village. The machine collected information efficiently, analyzed it methodically, filed it properly, but the machine had failed to understand what that information meant. The difference between knowing the 33rd Regiment was in the province and understanding that it might occupy Binh Ba was the difference between data and wisdom, and on June 6th, that gap would be measured in blood. At the Australian base at Nui Dat, the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was enjoying a rare stand-down after weeks of continuous operations. Alpha Company was taking rest and recreation at the seaside town of Vung Tau, where soldiers could swim in the ocean, drink cold beer, and temporarily forget about the war. Most of Delta Company was engaged in the mundane housekeeping tasks that consumed so much of military life: cleaning equipment, writing letters, organizing kit, catching up on sleep. The company commander, Major Murray Philip Blake, had graduated from the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1960, a professional officer who had commanded Delta Company with distinction throughout the battalion's second tour in Vietnam. His leadership had resulted in the destruction of over 2,000 enemy bunkers, the capture of significant quantities of weapons and supplies, and an enemy body count of 124 during the tour. Blake was known for aggressive patrolling, careful planning, and a willingness to take calculated risks when the tactical situation warranted. But on the morning of June 6th, he had no reason to expect anything more complicated than perhaps a brief contact with a small enemy force. The battalion's commanding officer was a man whose physical presence carried the weight of experience purchased in blood. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Nicholas Khan, known to his soldiers as Genghis, had graduated from Duntroon in December 1951 and been shipped to Korea as a young lieutenant with 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. On the night of November 10, 1952, Khan had led a fighting patrol during which machine gun rounds tore through his chest, destroying his right lung. He had been mentioned in dispatches for his leadership under fire, but the wound had left him with a permanent physical reminder that modern war could kill professional soldiers just as efficiently as it killed conscripts. The loss of his right lung meant that Khan lived every day with reduced physical capacity, a constant awareness of mortality that informed his approach to command. He pushed his soldiers hard because he knew that training intensity saved lives in combat. He demanded discipline because he understood that chaos killed. He planned meticulously because he had learned in Korea that improvisation and contact usually meant someone died. Now, at 36 years old, commanding 5 RAR on its second tour in Vietnam, Khan had built the Tiger Battalion into a tenacious combat unit through aggressive leadership, meticulous planning, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than maximum effort from every soldier under his command. When the report came through about the RPG attack on the Centurion tank, the initial response followed standard procedures. 2 platoons of regional forces were dispatched to investigate, moving cautiously into the southern edge of Binh Ba. They were immediately driven back by heavy automatic weapons fire that suggested something far more substantial than a handful of guerrillas armed with old rifles. The volume of fire and the sound of the weapons, the distinctive report of AK-47 assault rifles rather than the older SKS carbines typically carried by local Viet Cong, indicated that regular North Vietnamese Army troops were present in the village. The district chief, Major Tram Van Ngo, requested assistance from provincial headquarters in Ba Ria which in turn contacted 1st Australian Task Force. Since Binh Ba technically fell within the area of operations assigned to 6th Battalion, the initial notification went to Lieutenant Colonel David Butler, but his battalion was heavily engaged with enemy contacts several kilometers north of Nui Dat and could not disengage. The decision was made to deploy the Ready Reaction Force, which by the rotation schedule happened to be Delta Company, 5th RAR. Major Blake received the briefing at Task Force headquarters less than an hour after the initial tank contact. The intelligence assessment, compiled from regional force reports and aerial observation, estimated that approximately 2 enemy platoons, perhaps 40 to 60 men, had infiltrated the village overnight. Blake told his company sergeant major that there didn't seem to be too much in this, a casual assessment that would prove to be one of the most dangerous underestimations in Australian military history. He made the decision to bring along 6 newly arrived reinforcements who had just joined the battalion, reasoning that a relatively minor contact would provide them with valuable combat experience under controlled conditions. One of these soldiers was Private Wayne Teeling, a 21-year-old national serviceman from Bondi Junction in Sydney, whose wife Carolyn was 6 months pregnant with their first child. The Ready Reaction Force that assembled that morning consisted of an understrength Delta Company of just 65 men organized into 3 rifle platoons, 10, 11, and 12 platoons, plus company headquarters. The company was below its authorized strength because some soldiers were on leave, others were attending courses, and still others were performing duties at the battalion headquarters. This was the reality of maintaining a battalion in continuous operations. There were never quite enough bodies to fill every position on the organizational chart. Supporting them would be a composite troop of 4 Centurion tanks from 1st and 2nd Troops, B Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Brian Sullivan, and 13 M113 Armored Personnel Carriers from 3 Troop, B Squadron, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, under the command of Captain Ray DeVere. Artillery support would be provided by 105th Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, with Lieutenant Paul Stevens serving as forward observer attached to Delta Company. The plan was simple. Mount the infantry in the APCs, lead with the tanks, move to Binh Ba, link up with the district chief, and push the enemy out of the village. Expected duration, a few hours at most. Expected casualties, minimal. Perhaps a few wounded if the enemy chose to fight rather than run. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the column of tanks and APCs rolled out through the wire at Nui Dat and turned north on Route 2. The soldiers were in good spirits, joking and talking as they always did before an operation. The nervous energy channeled into banter and the kind of dark humor that combat soldiers have used since the beginning of warfare to manage their fear. They passed through Duke Mai, a hamlet approximately 1 kilometer south of Binh Ba, and received scattered small arms fire that was quickly suppressed by the heavy machine guns on the APCs. At 10:30, the force halted approximately 300 meters southeast of Binh Ba, while Major Blake coordinated with District Chief Ngo. The sound of sustained firing from within the village suggested that the regional forces were still in contact, and Vietnamese civilians could be seen fleeing along the roads leading south, carrying children and whatever possessions they could grab. Some pushed bicycles loaded with belongings. Others carried elderly relatives on their backs. The exodus of civilians was a clear indicator that something serious was happening in Binh Ba, but exactly what remained unclear. Ngo was attempting to evacuate the village population before authorizing the Australian assault, fully aware that the brick and tile houses would not protect civilians from the 84mm main guns of the Centurion tanks. He deployed his regional force troops into blocking positions to cut off enemy escape routes, a tactical decision that would prove optimistic in its assumptions about the enemy's intentions. The enemy had not come to Binh Ba to fight and withdraw. They had come to hold the village as long as possible, to inflict maximum casualties on the Australians, and to create a propaganda victory that could be exploited internationally. Overhead, helicopter gunships from No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, circled the village, their door gunners scanning for targets and reporting back to Blake what they could observe through breaks in the canopy and smoke. The reports were concerning. Additional enemy forces, perhaps 60 or more fighters, were spotted moving south and west of the village. The estimated 2 platoons were starting to look like something larger. At 11:20 in the morning, the waiting force came under rocket-propelled grenade fire from positions within the village. The smoke trails of the RPGs streaked across the open ground, and the distinctive crack thump of the weapons launching and detonating confirmed what the regional forces had already learned. The enemy was well armed and prepared to fight. District Chief Ngo made his decision. He turned to Blake and delivered the authorization that would seal the fate of Binh Ba. "Do what you have to do," he said, and added, "Knock down as many houses as you have to." He took personal responsibility for whatever damage would result from bringing tanks and heavy weapons into a populated village. It was a decision that reflected both the desperation of the tactical situation and the brutal calculus of counterinsurgency warfare. The village could be rebuilt. The villagers who died could not be brought back to life. But if the enemy was allowed to hold Binh Ba, the propaganda victory would be far more damaging than any physical destruction. Blake acknowledged the order and signaled his force to prepare for assault. The formation that moved toward Binh Ba at 11:20 was designed for maximum shock and firepower. Second Lieutenant Sullivan's 4 Centurion tanks led the advance, their massive treads churning up the red earth as they accelerated toward the village. Behind them came De Vere's 13 APCs spread across a front of approximately 300 meters, matching the width of the village itself. The infantry remained mounted, protected by the aluminum armor of the M113s as they closed the distance. At 300 meters from the first row of houses, Blake ordered the infantry to dismount and deploy in an extended line between the APCs. This was textbook combined arms assault doctrine, tanks leading to absorb enemy fire and deliver devastating return fire, APCs providing mobility and supporting fire with their heavy machine guns, and infantry ready to dismount and clear buildings once the armor had suppressed enemy positions. The formation looked impressive, professional, overwhelming. To the Australian soldiers advancing across the open ground, it must have seemed impossible that any enemy force could withstand the concentrated firepower they were bringing to bear. As the dismounted infantry moved forward in their assault line, 11 platoon in the center rear noticed something that immediately complicated the tactical situation. Civilians were still in the village. Despite Ngo's evacuation efforts, significant numbers of villagers remained, either unable to leave or unwilling to abandon their homes. The platoon was ordered to assist in moving these civilians to safety, a humanitarian mission that exposed the soldiers to enemy fire as they ushered frightened families toward the rear of the battle zone. The enemy occupying the first row of houses opened fire as the Australians approached, the distinctive chatter of AK-47 assault rifles mixing with the heavier sound of RPD machine guns. Private Wayne Teeling, advancing with 10 platoon on the right flank of the assault, was approaching the first line of houses when a round struck him in the neck. He collapsed immediately, the hydrostatic shock and catastrophic blood loss killing him within seconds. Teeling had been born on February 14, 1948, service number 2790880, and had grown up in Bondi Junction, close with his older brother and younger sister. He had been called up in the National Service Ballot, that lottery system that determined which 20-year-old Australian men would spend 2 years in the Army and which would continue their civilian lives uninterrupted. He had completed his training, shipped to Vietnam, joined Delta Company, and been told that morning that he would be going on an operation. It would be good experience, they said. A chance to see how things worked in combat. A relatively easy first contact that would break him in gradually. His wife Carolyn would give birth to their son Wayne 3 months later, a boy who would grow up knowing his father only through photographs and the stories that family members told. 2 soldiers broke from the assault line and dragged his body back under fire. But there was nothing medical science could do for a national serviceman whose first action had become his last, whose first minute of combat had been his final minute of life. He would never see his son, never hold Carolyn again, never grow old enough to tell the story of what happened at Binh Ba. Sergeant Brian London, acting commander of 10 platoon, saw where the fatal shot had originated and made an immediate tactical decision. He climbed onto the hull of a nearby Centurion tank and had the crew commander fire a high explosive round directly into the building. The 84mm shell punched through the wooden door and detonated inside, the overpressure and shrapnel killing everyone in the confined space. When Australian soldiers later searched the ruins, they found 6 enemy bodies. It was the first of hundreds of similar engagements that would characterize the next 8 hours. A brutal arithmetic of close-range violence where tanks would demolish buildings to protect infantry clearing them one room at a time. Sullivan, commanding the lead tanks from his exposed position in the cupola of the lead Centurion, was coordinating the movement of his troop and talking to an APC commander when he saw the smoke trail of an RPG arcing directly toward him. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow as his brain processed the visual information and understood that he was about to die. He shouted duck and threw himself forward into the turret, just as the rocket passed through the space where his head had been an instant before. The tail fin of the RPG grazed his shoulder and cut through his shirt, close enough that he could feel the heat of the rocket motor, close enough that the slipstream tousled his hair. The RPG missed both Sullivan and the APC commander and detonated harmlessly beyond their vehicles. Sullivan climbed back into position, heart hammering in his chest, and continued directing his troop. Death had passed within inches, and there were still hours of fighting ahead. The tanks pushed into the village with infantry following, their main guns demolishing buildings and their machine guns sweeping entire streets. Enemy soldiers firing RPG-7s from prepared positions targeted the Centurions with practiced precision, and the fighting intensified with every meter gained. The new model RPG-7 was significantly more effective than the older RPG-2 that Australian soldiers had encountered earlier in the war. The shaped charge warhead could penetrate the Centurion's armor at ranges up to 300 meters, and the enemy gunners had been trained to wait until the tanks closed to within 50 meters before firing, ensuring maximum penetration and accuracy. Defenders fired from windows and doorways, then withdrew into the bunkers that every house possessed. Small underground shelters originally built for protection during air raids, but now serving as fighting positions from which they could pop up after Australian soldiers had passed. Within 1 hour of beginning the assault, 3 of Sullivan's 4 tanks had been disabled through a combination of equipment damage and crew casualties. RPG rounds struck turrets and hulls, wounding tank commanders and crewmen, jamming traverse mechanisms and damaging fire control systems. One tank was forced to withdraw west with its last operational crew member, while the other 2 were immobilized in the center of the village, still firing but unable to maneuver. Sullivan's own tank left Binh Ba with its last round of canister ammunition loaded in the breech, having expended everything else in continuous firing. Blake realized with cold certainty that the assessment had missed the truth by a factor of 10. This was not 2 platoons of local Viet Cong. This was a battalion-strength force of North Vietnamese regulars who had prepared defensive positions, pre-positioned ammunition, and were fighting with a determination that suggested they intended to hold Binh Ba regardless of casualties. Helicopter gunships overhead reported that an enemy company was forming up in the rubber trees east of the village, preparing to counterattack the Australian penetration. Blake ordered his armor to engage the forming company, and the Centurions and APCs pivoted to sweep the tree line with concentrated machine gun fire, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy before they could launch their attack. But the tactical situation was untenable. With 3 tanks disabled, his infantry taking casualties, and the enemy strength obviously far greater than anticipated, Blake made the decision that saved Delta Company from destruction. He ordered his force to break contact and withdraw to the western edge of the village to reorganize. The fighting as Delta Company extracted itself from the village was fierce and confused, the kind of close-range chaos that defied detailed description. Soldiers moved from building to building, firing and moving, covering each other's withdrawal, while enemy rounds snapped past their heads and ricocheted off the APCs. By 1300 hours, the battered force had pulled back and established a hasty defensive position. The butcher's bill for the first assault was sobering. Teeling was dead. Multiple soldiers were wounded. 3 of 4 tanks were combat ineffective. And somewhere in the maze of houses and bunkers behind them, at least 200 and possibly as many as 400 enemy soldiers were reorganizing their own positions and preparing for the Australians to try again. At 1200 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Khan established a forward tactical headquarters at the district post in Duc Than, north of Binh Ba, and assumed overall command of Operation Hammer from Lieutenant Colonel Butler. Khan's assessment of the tactical situation was that the enemy operation probably had one or both of 2 aims. It was part of a countrywide offensive designed to influence the peace negotiations, or it was an attempt to relieve pressure on the 33rd Regiment's headquarters to the north, where 6th Battalion was operating. Either way, it was now clear that Binh Ba represented a significant enemy commitment, and Khan committed additional forces to match it. B Company, 5th RAR, under the command of Major Rain Ilma Herring, was dispatched from Nui Dat, with orders to establish blocking positions south and east of the village to prevent enemy withdrawal or reinforcement. Simultaneously, C Company was reacted to another enemy attack on Hoa Long village to the south of Nui Dat, confirming that the assault on Binh Ba was part of a coordinated multi-point offensive. The enemy had not simply occupied one village. They had launched simultaneous attacks designed to stretch Australian resources and prevent concentration of force at any single point. The system that had sent Delta Company in unprepared now delivered fresh tanks and ammunition with clinical efficiency. Helicopters from No. 9 Squadron arrived over the battlefield with replacement tank crews, ammunition, and medical evacuation capability. The wounded, including Sullivan, were lifted out and flown to the field hospital at Vung Tau. Fresh crews were delivered to the disabled tanks, and ammunition boxes were lowered to the waiting infantry below. Sergeant Jock Browning's 4 troop from B Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, arrived with fresh Centurion tanks to replace the disabled vehicles. No one at headquarters was being held accountable for the intelligence failure. No one was asking why 65 men had been ordered to assault a battalion-strength position. The machine simply adjusted, adapted, and continued. By 1400 hours, Delta Company had been reinforced, rearmed, and reorganized. Blake had learned from the morning's disaster and revised his tactical approach. Instead of tanks leading with mounted infantry following, he would reverse the sequence. Infantry would lead the assault, with each of the 3 platoons supported by 1 tank and 2 APCs in close support. The assault would come from the west, pushing east through the village, forcing the enemy back against B Company's blocking positions. The second assault began at 1400 hours with infantry in the lead, moving in squad-sized elements through the western edge of Binh Ba. The refined tactics that would eventually be codified in military doctrine were developed through brutal trial and error over the next 4 hours. When a house was identified as occupied by enemy forces, a tank would maneuver into position and fire a high explosive round through the wooden door or directly through the brick wall. The explosion would create a breach without necessarily bringing down the entire structure. The tank would then fire a canister round through the breach, essentially a giant shotgun shell containing hundreds of steel projectiles that would sweep the interior of the building, killing or wounding anyone inside. Only then would infantry teams of 2 to 3 men enter the building, moving room to room, clearing corners, checking every closet and alcove, throwing grenades into the underground bunkers that connected houses through a network of tunnels. The sequence was methodical, repetitive, brutal in its efficiency. This pattern, tank fires high explosive, tank fires canister, infantry secures, became the rhythm of the afternoon's fighting. It was repeated dozens of times as the Australians worked their way through the southern edge of the village, building by building, killing enemy soldiers who fought from prepared positions, and finding others who had discarded their uniforms and attempted to blend in with the civilians still trapped in the battle zone. The presence of civilians required the Australians to expose themselves to extreme danger, holding their fire when they were uncertain whether the figures in front of them were combatants or terrified villagers trying to flee. Many times, Australian soldiers chose to accept the risk to themselves rather than shoot someone who might be innocent. Some enemy soldiers removed their webbing and weapons and tried to escape alongside genuine civilians. Others fought to the death in their positions, maintaining fire until Australian infantry killed them at point-blank range. The moral complexity of urban combat, where enemies could transform into civilians in seconds, and where every doorway might hide either a fighter or a family, created impossible situations that required junior soldiers to make decisions with life or death consequences. One platoon commander was wounded in a face-to-face encounter with a Viet Cong fighter who had concealed himself in a house. The enemy soldier threw a grenade that exploded close enough to wound the Australian officer, but the lieutenant survived the blast and killed his attacker with a rifle shot before collapsing. The raw leadership displayed throughout the afternoon was remarkable, considering the age and experience of those making life-and-death decisions. Of the 21 rifle sections that Delta Company sent into the battle, 12 were commanded by private soldiers, the lowest rank in the Army, men who in peacetime would have been considered too junior to lead anything more complicated than a work detail. 2 platoons were led by sergeants and 1 by a corporal. These junior soldiers made decisions about when to fire and when to hold fire, when to advance and when to take cover, when to risk their lives for civilians, and when the tactical situation demanded prioritizing the mission over individual lives. They were 19, 20, 21 years old, and they were commanding men in combat through urban terrain against an enemy that had every advantage except firepower. Captain DeVere, commanding the APCs that were providing mobile fire support, watched one attempted escape that perfectly illustrated the complexity of the fighting. A man emerged from the village with his hands raised in surrender, clearly trying to present himself as a non-combatant. DeVere noticed the military webbing barely concealed under the man's civilian shirt. He pointed at the incriminating equipment. The would-be escapee shrugged and smiled before surrendering. 3 Viet Cong were captured under the Chu Hoi program, which promised safety and good treatment to enemy soldiers who voluntarily surrendered. Another was captured to the east of Binh Ba after being wounded. But these were exceptions. Most of the enemy forces in the village fought with a determination that suggested they had been ordered to hold Binh Ba regardless of the cost. Some fought until they were killed. Others fought until they ran out of ammunition and then attempted to escape. The variation in enemy behavior suggested that different units had received different orders, or perhaps that individual fighters were making their own decisions about when the tactical situation had become hopeless. The fighting continued all afternoon with an intensity that left both sides exhausted. Sergeant London's actions throughout the day would earn him the Distinguished Conduct Medal, though the specific details of his performance beyond directing the tank fire that killed Teeling's shooter were lost in the chaos of sustained combat. The after-action report would later note that the fighting was so fierce and confused for several hours that detailed description was impossible. What could be documented was that the Australians advanced through the village one building at a time, that the enemy contested every meter, and that by the time the sun began to set at approximately 1800 hours, Delta Company had been in continuous combat for 8 hours. The physical and psychological toll was visible on every face. Soldiers moved with the mechanical efficiency of exhaustion, executing their drills through muscle memory because conscious thought had become too difficult. Some were wounded but refused evacuation. Others were uninjured but looked like they had aged years in a single afternoon. When the shooting finally stopped at last light, the Australians established a defensive harbor with all-around security, positioning themselves to defend against a possible night counterattack. The soldiers were beyond exhaustion, their uniforms soaked with sweat and stained with brick dust and dried blood, their hands shaking from adrenaline depletion, their ears ringing from sustained gunfire in confined spaces. Delta Company had fought its way through perhaps half the village, clearing building after building, killing enemy soldiers and capturing others, but they had not secured Binh Ba. The enemy was still present somewhere in the darkness, and tomorrow they would have to resume the methodical, brutal process of clearing the remaining structures. B Company, which had established blocking positions in the rubber plantation south of Binh Ba during the afternoon, harbored for the night with their own all-around defensive perimeter. The soldiers of both companies sat in their positions through the tropical night, hyper-vigilant despite their exhaustion, starting at every sound that might indicate an enemy counterattack or infiltration attempt. During the night, B Company killed 2 Viet Cong who attempted to break out of the village to the south, confirming that at least some enemy forces were attempting to withdraw rather than fight to the death. The sound of occasional rifle shots punctuated the darkness as nervous sentries fired at shadows or legitimate targets, and the low murmur of radio traffic coordinated preparations for the morning's operations. No one slept deeply. Every soldier remained aware that they were surrounded by an enemy who had already proven willing to fight at close quarters, and the darkness magnified every threat. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 7th, B Company soldiers in the rubber plantation south of Binh Ba noticed a large group of figures approaching through the trees from the direction of the village. The initial assessment was that they were friendly provincial forces, and soldiers from both groups waved at each other in greeting. Then someone recognized the uniforms and equipment as North Vietnamese Army issue, and the realization hit simultaneously on both sides. This was an enemy company, approximately 100 men, attempting to reinforce their comrades in Binh Ba. Both forces opened fire at nearly the same moment, and a sharp firefight erupted in the rubber plantation. The enemy, realizing they had run directly into a prepared Australian blocking position, rapidly withdrew to the south after taking casualties. It was the last attempt by enemy forces to reinforce the garrison in Binh Ba, and its failure sealed the fate of those soldiers still in the village. The morning sweep of June 7th began with a combined force that included D Company, 5 platoon from B Company, 2 combat engineer teams from 1st Field Squadron, and the supporting tanks and APCs. The systematic clearance resumed with the same methodology that had characterized the previous afternoon's fighting, though enemy resistance was noticeably lighter. Some North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers had withdrawn during the night. Others remained hidden in bunkers, hoping to be overlooked or to escape after the Australians moved on. Tracker dogs were used to locate tunnel entrances, and every house had to be searched thoroughly, every bunker checked, every possible hiding place investigated. The work was tedious, dangerous, and exhausting. Each house required the same careful approach: suppress with fire, clear with grenades, search methodically, move to the next house, repeat. By noon on June 7th, the western half of the village was declared clear, and the task of completing the eastern half was handed over to Popular Force troops, who were better able to communicate with the remaining civilian population and who could more easily distinguish local residents from infiltrators. At 1300 hours, fighting erupted at Duc Trung, a hamlet approximately 1 kilometer north of Binh Ba that housed the rubber processing plant and worker accommodations. Elements of the enemy's Chau Duc District Company had occupied positions in Duc Trung overnight, and Australian forces moved north to engage them in support of regional and Popular Force troops. However, the presence of civilians who had not been evacuated from the hamlet caused Lieutenant Colonel Khan to make a critical decision. Rather than risk civilian casualties by conducting an Australian assault, he ordered his forces to withdraw and leave the clearing of Duc Trung to the Vietnamese forces who could communicate more effectively with the local population. The decision prioritized civilian protection over tactical expediency, a choice that reflected the complex political and humanitarian considerations that governed Australian operations in Vietnam. The war was not simply about killing enemy soldiers. It was about winning the support of the South Vietnamese population, and every civilian killed by Allied forces was a propaganda victory for the Communists. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 8th, a final sweep of Binh Ba was conducted by combined Australian and Vietnamese forces. By 9 o'clock, Operation Hammer was officially concluded. The village was confirmed clear of organized enemy resistance. Members of the 1st Australian Civil Affairs Unit entered Binh Ba that morning and found a scene of utter devastation. Approximately 1 in 5 houses had been completely destroyed, their walls collapsed into piles of rubble, their contents buried under brick and tile. Every other house in the village had suffered some degree of damage, ranging from shattered windows and shrapnel-pocked walls to partially collapsed roofs and demolished interior walls. The mathematics of destruction suggested that somewhere between 50 and 60% of the village's physical infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed in 48 hours of fighting. The white-gabled school that had been a landmark was damaged, but still standing. The church had holes in its walls, but remained structurally intact. But many of the houses that villagers had lived in for generations were now uninhabitable rubble. The human cost was tallied with the clinical precision required by military bureaucracy. 1 Australian soldier had been killed in action, Private Wayne Teeling. Between 10 and 11 Australian soldiers had been wounded, the majority of them tank commanders and crewmen who had been exposed in their cupolas when RPG rounds struck their vehicles. 4 Centurion tanks had suffered damage from enemy fire, though all were repairable and would return to service. The tanks had proven both vulnerable and essential, a paradox that would inform armor doctrine for decades. The enemy casualties were more difficult to count with precision. Australian engineers and plant operators from 1st Field Squadron and 21st Engineer Support Troop dug mass graves and buried 99 to 107 confirmed enemy dead who had been left on the battlefield. The bodies lay where they had fallen, in houses, in bunkers, in the streets, in the rubber plantation. Blood trails, drag marks, and abandoned equipment suggested that many more casualties had been removed by the enemy during the night of June 6th and throughout June 7th. The Australian assessment estimated that total enemy killed and died of wounds ranged from 200 to 400 fighters. 8 enemy soldiers had been detained for interrogation. 3 had been captured under the Chiu Hoi program after surrendering. Others had been captured while attempting to escape the village in civilian clothes, their military identity given away by webbing or equipment that they had failed to fully conceal. An unknown number of civilians had died during the fighting, despite the district chief's evacuation efforts, and despite the Australian soldiers' attempts to protect non-combatants. The exact number of civilian casualties would never be determined with certainty, but post-battle assessments acknowledged that some villagers who had been unable or unwilling to leave had been killed in the crossfire or in the destruction of buildings. Each civilian death was a tragedy and a political liability, ammunition for communist propaganda that would portray the battle as an atrocity rather than a legitimate military operation. The medals and commendations followed with the predictable rhythm of military bureaucracy. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn received the Distinguished Service Order for his outstanding aggressive leadership, drive, inspiration, enthusiasm, dedication, and meticulous planning throughout the tour. Major Murray Blake received the Military Cross for his aggressive leadership and skillful handling of his company. Captain Ray DeVere received the Military Cross for his command of the armored personnel carriers. Second Lieutenant Brian Sullivan, the national serviceman who had come within inches of death when an RPG passed through the space where his head had been, received the Military Cross for his leadership of the tank troop under sustained fire. Sergeant Brian London received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions throughout the battle. Corporal Peter Strudwick received the Military Medal. Second Lieutenant Peter Rogers, one of the helicopter pilots who had flown through the artillery fire and the storm of ground fire to evacuate wounded and deliver fresh crews, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Battle Honour Binh Ba was awarded to the Royal Australian Regiment, the 1st Armoured Regiment, and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, a formal recognition that would be carried on their colours and commemorated in their histories. But for every medal awarded to an officer or senior non-commissioned officer, there were private soldiers who had led rifle sections through 8 hours of close-quarters combat and received nothing. The 12 privates who had commanded sections because there were not enough corporals and sergeants to go around, who had made life-and-death decisions while barely out of their teens, were not recognized with gallantry awards. Their names do not appear in the official citations. Their courage was acknowledged verbally by their officers and their peers. But the formal recognition system that distributed medals based on rank and position rather than actual performance under fire passed them by. The official photographs of enemy dead lying in the village square were later used by critics to support unfounded accusations of war crimes, a propaganda effort that ignored the legitimate combat context in which those casualties had occurred and the extensive efforts Australian soldiers had made to protect civilians during the fighting. The reconstruction of Binh Ba began immediately under the coordination of 1st Australian Civil Affairs Unit. Australian engineers led the physical reconstruction effort, which took approximately 1 month to complete the bulk of the work. The village school, which had been damaged during the fighting, was rebuilt by B Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, and reopened in November of 1969. Many villagers whose homes had been destroyed were resettled with Australian assistance, though the legacy of the battle remained complex. Some villagers were grateful for the reconstruction efforts and for the security that Australian dominance in Phuoc Tuy province would provide in the coming years. Others resented the destruction of their homes and the death of family members, regardless of who had initiated the battle or what military necessity had demanded. The tension between gratitude and resentment, between appreciation for reconstruction and anger at destruction, would characterize the relationship between the Australians and the villagers of Binh Ba for the remainder of the war. The 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment withdrew from Phuoc Tuy province after the battle, moving into sanctuary areas in neighboring provinces where Australian forces could not pursue them without crossing operational boundaries. The regiment had lost its 1st Battalion as an effective fighting force, with casualties so severe that it would require months of rest and refitting before it could conduct sustained operations again. The D440 Provincial Mobile Battalion similarly withdrew to recuperate and rebuild. The Battle of Binh Ba marked the end of large-scale main force operations in Phuoc Tuy province. Although Australian forces would occasionally encounter North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units in the years to come, they would never again face a battalion-strength force that chose to stand and fight rather than withdraw when confronted with Australian firepower. The tactical lesson was clear. Direct confrontation with Australian combined arms forces in terrain where armor could be employed resulted in catastrophic casualties for the enemy. The tactical lessons learned at Binh Ba would influence military doctrine for decades, though the path from battlefield to classroom was neither direct nor immediate. The most immediate lesson concerned the paradox of armored warfare in urban terrain. Yes, the Centurions were vulnerable to RPG fire. 3 of 4 tanks had been disabled within the first hour of the initial assault, and tank commanders sitting exposed in their cupolas had been priority targets for enemy riflemen and machine gunners. but the tanks had also been the battle-winning factor. To use the phrase from the after-action report, the combination of their 84mm main guns and their heavy machine guns had provided the concentrated firepower necessary to suppress enemy positions and create breaches through which infantry could advance. Without the tanks, Delta Company would likely have been pinned down and destroyed. Both truths could coexist. The Centurions were vulnerable, and they were essential. And understanding this paradox became fundamental to developing urban warfare doctrine. The specific technique of using high explosive rounds to breach buildings, followed by canister rounds to clear the interiors, followed by infantry assault to secure the structure, became a template for urban warfare that military forces around the world would study and adapt. The Battle of Binh Ba demonstrated that combined arms coordination at the individual building level was not just possible, but essential for success in urban terrain. Infantry could not clear fortified buildings without armored support. Tanks could not operate in close terrain without infantry protection. Artillery and air support could suppress enemy forces but could not hold ground. Remove any single element and the entire system failed. This understanding of combined arms warfare as an integrated system, rather than a collection of independent capabilities, represented a significant evolution in tactical thinking that would be applied in conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan in the decades to come. The validation of junior leadership was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the battle, though it received less attention in official analyses than the combined arms lessons. 12 of 21 rifle sections had been commanded by private soldiers during the fighting. These were men who in peacetime would have been considered too junior to be trusted with anything more than basic tasks. Yet they had led their sections through sustained close-quarters combat, made tactical decisions under fire, and brought their soldiers through alive. The Australian Army's emphasis on training soldiers at all levels, on ensuring that every individual understood not just his own job, but the jobs of those above and below him, had been vindicated in the most brutal testing ground imaginable. A military force that could function effectively when more than half its section commanders were the lowest-ranking soldiers was a military force that could absorb casualties and continue fighting. This lesson about the importance of comprehensive training and the delegation of tactical authority would influence military education and doctrine development for generations. The assessment that sent 65 against 400 received remarkably little institutional scrutiny. No intelligence officer was relieved of duty for the catastrophic underestimate. No new procedures were implemented to prevent similar failures in the future. The institutional response was essentially to note that the enemy had surprised them, that the Australians had adapted and won anyway, and to move on. This pattern of ignoring systemic failures because tactical competence had overcome strategic mistakes would be repeated in conflicts for decades to come. A dangerous precedent that suggested individual heroism could always compensate for institutional incompetence. The question of why the intelligence was so wrong, why the dots were not connected, why Delta Company was sent in blind, was never adequately answered. The machine that had failed continued operating as if nothing had happened. Binh Ba was remembered differently in Australia than the more famous Battle of Long Tan that had occurred in August of 1966. Long Tan had the advantage of occurring earlier in the war, when public attention was focused on Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Long Tan had a more dramatic narrative arc, with a single company fighting against regimental-strength forces in a monsoon. Long Tan had generated a significant awards controversy that kept it in the public consciousness. Binh Ba, by contrast, occurred in June of 1969 when the Australian public was growing weary of the war and when American troop withdrawals were already beginning to signal that the Allied commitment was not indefinite. The battle was reported and praised as a significant victory, but it did not capture the national imagination in the same way. Yet for those who studied military history and tactics, Binh Ba was in many ways more significant than Long Tan. It was the fiercest urban combat Australians fought in Vietnam. It was the most intensive combined arms operation at the company level. It was the clearest demonstration of what junior leadership could accomplish under impossible circumstances. Yet for the soldiers who fought at Binh Ba, and for the families of those who died there, the battle was anything but a footnote. Carolyn Teeling buried her husband at Botany General Cemetery in Sydney on June 18, 1969, with full military honors. She was 6 months pregnant and 21 years old. Her son Wayne would grow up without his father, knowing him only through photographs and the stories that family members told. In later years, Teeling's niece Sandy would visit Vietnam and drop a rose quartz crystal, given to her by Carolyn, into Halong Bay as a gesture of respect and remembrance for an uncle she had never known. The tragedy of one soldier killed in his first action, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a son who would never meet him, crystallized the human cost of the battle in a way that casualty statistics could not capture. The bonds formed in combat at Binh Ba proved more enduring than the physical structures destroyed there. Troopers Roy Dodd and Ray Collins, who had served together as gunner and driver in a Centurion tank, became best friends for life. 50 years after the battle, they would still refer to each other as best mates, describing how the shared experience of surviving what should have killed them had created a connection that transcended normal friendship. They didn't shake hands, they said. They hugged. That was what they did. Similar bonds connected other survivors. Men who had fought beside each other in the brick houses and banana plantations of Binh Ba, and who would maintain those connections through the decades that followed. The 50th anniversary of the Battle of Binh Ba in June of 2019 brought renewed attention to the battle and its participants. A national commemoration service was held at the Australian Vietnam Forces National Memorial on Anzac Parade in Canberra. Last post ceremonies were conducted at the Australian War Memorial, specifically honoring Private Wayne Teeling and other participants in the battle. Brigadier Colin Kahn, retired and in his 80s, spoke about the battle before wreaths were laid by veterans and by members of Teeling's family. The Australian War Memorial displayed photographs, documents, and equipment from the battle, including a Centurion tank that had seen service in Vietnam and bore the scars of combat. The 50th anniversary provided an opportunity for fuller acknowledgement of the battle's complexity, its tactical significance, and the cost paid by both soldiers and civilians. The lessons of Binh Ba would be studied by military forces facing similar urban combat challenges in the decades that followed. When American and coalition forces fought in Iraqi cities like Fallujah in 2004, they employed many of the same combined arms tactics that had been developed at Binh Ba. When Australian forces operated in Afghanistan, the emphasis on junior leadership and on training every soldier to step up when casualties created leadership vacancies reflected the institutional memory of battles like Binh Ba, where privates had commanded sections successfully. The specific details of the battle, the grid layout of the village, the use of bunkers under houses, the challenge of distinguishing civilians from combatants appeared in case studies taught at staff colleges and in urban warfare training courses around the world. What happened at Binh Ba on June 6th and 7th, 1969, proved that small professional forces using combined arms tactics could dominate urban terrain against numerically superior enemies who held the advantages of position, preparation, and intimate familiarity with the ground. It demonstrated that junior soldiers, if properly trained and trusted by their commanders, could make complex decisions under extreme pressure and lead their peers through sustained combat. It showed that armor, despite vulnerability in close terrain, remained essential for providing the concentrated firepower needed to suppress fortified positions and create entry points for infantry assault. And it revealed the terrible cost when tactical competence and individual courage are forced to compensate for strategic failures. On the morning of June 6, 1969, Delta Company expected to fight 40 Viet Cong and found 400 North Vietnamese regulars waiting for them. The plan was based on an assessment that missed reality by a factor of 10, and one 21-year-old soldier died in his first minute of combat because someone in an air-conditioned headquarters got the numbers wrong. But here's what the failure couldn't destroy. Privates who commanded rifle sections through 8 hours of hell. Tank crews who continued firing even as rockets shredded their armor. Junior leaders who made life and death decisions about civilians mixed with enemy combatants, and more often than not, chose to risk their own lives rather than shoot the uncertain. The official history calls Binh Ba a decisive victory. They're not wrong. The Australians killed or wounded 400 enemy soldiers while losing one of their own. They secured the village. They forced the entire 33rd Regiment out of the province. By every tactical measure, it was a triumph. But victories built on flawed assessments and paid for with soldiers' blood don't deserve parades. They deserve questions. Binh Ba taught the world how to fight in cities, building by building. Tank fires high explosive, tank fires canister, infantry secures. Repeat until the enemy is dead or the village is rubble. But the real lesson is simpler and darker. Sometimes 65 men accomplish the impossible, and sometimes one of them doesn't make it home to meet his son. That's the truth. That's what happened in the brick streets of Binh Ba. Now you know